Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1153 continues the Loki flashback with some bombshell reveals, so let's get right into it. Starting things off with our 37th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Circuit Pilgrimage cover story, we find Yamato having made it to the region of Ringo and being greeted by the new daimyo, Kiku Nojo. We had suspected Kiku to be this region's leader since she was originally born in Ringo alongside her brother Izo. Just beneath them is also the Yakuza boss Cho, who we haven't seen since the end of the raid on Onigashima, where she was seen celebrating alongside other Yakuza bosses. We saw Hyogoro toward the start of this cover story in the flower capital alongside Nekomamushi, but this is the first time we've heard from the other region's Yakuza bosses since the Wano arc. With Yamato having gone through all of the other regions already, I'm not sure that we'll get to see them in this cover story at this point. That said, let's get into chapter 1153, The Birth of Loki. Now this is the second chapter titled after a specific character's birth in the series, with the last one having been Bonnie's in the previous arc. While we left off the last chapter with a 45-year-old Harald rampaging through the seas 109 years ago, we go back a few decades prior to start this one off, as we find Harald playing around with his childhood friends, Dory and Brogy. They all seem to have gotten some hits off on each other, as evidenced by their bandages, though Dory seems to have a nasty bump on his head as well. In the back, an older woman is not too happy with this roughhousing, which makes me wonder if this could either be Dory or Brogy's mother, whom you'll recall that they said they had feared several chapters ago. It's been established in the previous chapter that Harald was from the same generation as the giant pirate captains, but it's nice to see their relationship formalized like this. Dory and Brogy are shown wielding a sword and an axe respectively, the precursors to the Terry sword and the bruiser axe that they would use during their adult life, while Harald is curiously shown with a hammer or mallet. Later on, he would take to the sword, but it's nice to see that this preference would eventually be shared by his son Loki. Moving back to around 109 years ago, we find Harald sailing on a royal ship, expressing his boredom with how weak and small the world outside of Elbaf is. In a scene reminiscent of Mr. Five's Nesbon cannon, Harald flicks a booger off into the ocean with such force that it resembles a cannonball and displaces a shark. Something so mundane having such destructive power is also a bit reminiscent of the scene from the end of Little Garden, where Brogy's tears come down like a waterfall around the Straw Hats. This chapter also introduces us to Hajrudin's mother, Ida. We find her working at a circus in the Bunt Kingdom, where she pretends to be a giant from Elbaf, donning fake horns and fur clothing. Seeing this performance from afar infuriates Harald and prompts him to rescue her, and this of course leads to his giant reality check and provides him with the revelation that his stature and status are only coincidences of his birth and are not things that make him better than others. The circumstances of one's birth being irrelevant comes back into play again in this chapter with the births of Hajrudin and Loki later on, but more on that in just a bit. Ida also mentions that it's this sort of behavior that gives all giants a bad name and blames it on the reputation of Elbaf giants being barbaric and savage, something that we first heard from Saul back during Robin's flashback. Coincidentally, both Saul and Ida originally hail from the South Blue, with the latter being said to have come from Samwanai Island, which in the original Japanese can have a meaning akin to not being cold. I'm not sure if there's any sort of greater significance to this name, perhaps playing into the idea of the South Blue being home to various tropical warm islands, or if it's true that Saul comes from there, maybe it could be taken as a nod to his future of being frozen and surviving. Now Saul and Ida do have some interesting similarities on top of coming from the same ocean. For one, they have very similar pronounced lips, giving them both a rectangular mouth shape, and not only that, but our introduction to both characters involves a fake growl in an attempt to inspire fear, only for us to quickly learn that they are just gentle giants. Ida even mentions that she washed up on this island, much like Saul did on Nohara. Who knows, maybe Ida is even related to Saul, making her full name Jaguar D. Ida, which in turn would make Hajrudin a D as well. Interesting possibilities ahead. Earlier in the arc, we had learned that Harald was the one who asked Saul to create the Walrus School in Elbaf 20 years prior, so perhaps it's this connection with Ida that made Harald look fondly on Saul's ideals. For a while, we speculated on this channel that Mother Carmel may have influenced Harald with her views of peace over war and trade over plunder, but as it seems from this chapter, this line of thinking was something that Harald arrived on his own from exploring the outside world as a benevolent king. In fact, despite Loki having been born around the time Big Mom and Mother Carmel lived on Elbaf, we skip over them entirely in this chapter, but I'll talk more about that later. One quick note here is that Ida is said to be 10 meters tall, at least as part of the circus act. This would make her the new shortest full-blooded giant yet, as up until now, that status has belonged to Morley, who is around 12 meters tall. For some greater context, Hajrudin is supposed to be around 22 meters in the present day, and the other South Blue giant Saul tall is 19.5 meters as well. Though this could all just be part of the circus act, as there are humans who have never seen a giant proper and would have no real sense of how tall they are on average. When we see her standing beside Harald, who is supposed to be much larger than other normal giants, thanks to his ancient giant heritage, she's about half his size. Harald eventually comes to and realizes that the humans he had discredited for so long are actually quite skilled and interesting in their own right, taking note of things such as their construction methods, their spices, and artisan work. We get this montage of Harald coming to appreciate the tiny humans of the Bunt Kingdom, capping it off with the classic Nika dance. Now, a big part of this chapter is seeing Harald travel the world and pick up all the experiences that would inform his benevolent change in nature. It's with this that we get a good look at the royal ship that we first saw back in the last chapter, though its design is a bit different now. Previously, it had a dark figurehead up front with a dark trim around the top of the boat, but now we see a much more regal design instead, with a coat of arms or shield just below the figurehead that resembles some sort of dragon or dinosaur-like creature. We see there's another serpentine figurehead on the cabin side back as well, and this sail features a helmeted skull with 2 axes as crossbones overlaid on top of 3 vertical lines. This is distinct from the Jolly Roger of the giant warrior pirates who use 2 swords or sabers instead of axes. We see this symbol pretty often throughout this chapter, with Harald sporting it on his belt buckle as well as the bottles he barters with. Ida also mentions that she crossed the red line to get here, which Harald refers to as the Serpent of Blood. This effectively confirms a very long-held theory in the fandom that the blood-soaked snake mentioned by Dory and Brogy back during the tail end of the Little Garden arc was in fact the indestructible Red Line. This is an explicit nod to the Norse mythological creature known as the Jormungandr, or the World Serpent, a giant snake-like being that encircles the earth, biting its own tail, much like the Red Line spans across the blue planet. It is said that Jormungandr letting go of its own tail is one of the indications that Ragnarok has come, which parallels the idea that the Red Line's destruction will be seen at the climax of the series. We get the scene of Harald returning to Elbaf roughly 4 years later and relaying his newfound experiences to the people. This seems to be the formal beginning of Harald's campaign of reforms, as he announces that he wishes to continue traveling to learn from various cultures and better Elbaf. In the crowd, you can spot Panda Man for the first time in this chapter, as we see him again just a few pages later, listening in on Harald's adventures. While some of the giants in the audience are reluctant, it seems the elders Jarl and Jorl are pleased at Harald's new leaf. We had seen them express annoyance with Mother Carmel's ideals of trade over plunder just 63 years ago, so I wonder if there's some sort of retconning going on from Oda's side, or if they just didn't want those ideals being forced upon them by an outsider. In either case, they view Harald's development as a sign of good fortune for Elbaf, which creates a stark contrast to everything surrounding Loki's curse toward the end of the chapter. In this scene set between 105 and 81 years ago, we find Harald keeping a log of his travels and experiences, much like how we saw Odin do during his time at sea. There are a lot of striking parallels between Odin and Harald, with both of them being bigger-than-life royals who wish to explore outside of their countries. They both end up meeting their loved ones through their journeys, and they both wish to open their countries to the outside world's influences. In Odin's case, his journal ended up being read by his son, Momonosuke, and so I wonder if there's some chance that Loki ends up reading Harald's book as well. This could allow for something cool, where more of this flashback is being relayed by Loki than we first expected, as we had initially thought the events surrounding Harald's life to be simply for us as told by an omniscient narrator. In such a case though, there could be some room for an unreliable narrator situation, with Loki being the trickster he has been made out to be, lying and saying anything to get his freedom. I don't know that Oda would necessarily go that route and mess with the integrity of a flashback, but it could be interesting. Now, speaking of Odin, we also learn in this chapter that Harald actually visited the region of Wano around 70 years ago. We see the same vertical cliffs amongst the ukiyo-e-esque inspired weather conditions that we saw when the Straw Hats were approaching that area. It's not necessarily clear if Harald actually made it into the country, since Wano has been closed off for a long time, but we do see Harald interacting with some of the local people in this scene, as you can spot a samurai with 2 katana on their hips. This background features the same cliffs and bonsai-like trees, so this is likely still in that area. We learn from this that Elbaf was very advanced in navigation and ended up teaching these people how to travel the ocean. Harald explains the concept of a pole star to these people as a northern star that never moves. Now, this is a real-world concept that describes a star that is positioned very close to the planet's axis of rotation. It should also be noted that Loketown is located on the Pole Star Islands, and that the pole star is a type of lodestar, or a star that helps guide travelers, which is also the name of the penultimate island on the Grand Line before Laugh Tale. Now, Harald teaching people of Wano how to traverse the seas is fairly important because, if you recall, one of the few instances of Wano natives leaving the country occurred 55 years prior to the present day, roughly 15 years after the scene in the chapter. As we learn in the Volume 105 SBS, a group of 25 people left Wano during that time and made their way down to the East Blue, where the Polestar Islands are located. Some of these folks settled down and founded Shimotsky Village, but it's unknown what became of the others. It's quite probable that this voyage was only made possible thanks to the King of Elbaf sharing their knowledge with the sailors of Wano. It should also be noted that Higurashi, who would have been roughly in their 20s or 30s at this time, was said to have left the country for a while, having even met with outsiders such as Shiki. It's possible she was only able to make this voyage if it was distinct from the one that occurred 55 years prior, thanks to Harald's instructions as well. We also learn from this chapter that Harald traveled through Fishman Island, meaning he must have made his way to the Paradise half of Grand Line as well. The villagers are enticed by the concept of fishmen and mermaids, just as we saw in the present day with the giants crowding around Jinbei. It seemed Harald had gone down there around 70 years ago, since that's when Neptune was born, and he mentions that even the sea creatures were celebrating Neptune's birth, which may be in reference to the Sea Kings, who would have been excited at the prospect of being closer to the birth of the mermaid princess, Shirahoshi. This scene is very evocative of the scene from the Nolan flashback, where he is recounting his travels to the country of dwarves, which we would learn to be Greenbit. This scene also features a Panda Man cameo, just like this one, though we also see a bear and a squirrel in attendance as well. While Harald's journeys are incredibly interesting and make me wish we spent more time with him at sea, all of this serves as a prelude to the births of his children, Hajrudin and Loki. 81 years ago in the Fisherman Village, located in the eastern region of the Sun World, we find Harald and Ida welcoming the birth of their child, Hajrudin. This is the 5th village that we've learned of in Elbaf, with the first one being the Warrior Village in the west, where most of this arc has taken place, the Artisan Village in the southeast, the Huntsman Village in the northwest, and we learned about the Haugen Village, which no longer exists, and later in this chapter, we learn about the Brewers Village to the north, making 6 distinct villages. This makes me wonder if there is a village for each of the cardinal and ordinal directions. Harald's desire to marry Ida and live in the Aros castle is denied by some mysterious elders who are hell-bent on keeping the royal bloodline pure. We had first learned of this back when Rhoda was explaining the political and cultural climate of Elbaf to the Straw Hats, and it was around then that we also got mention of some village elders besides Jarl. It's been hinted that there were people in charge outside of him, so it's nice to finally see them actually exist in some form, but being kept in silhouette is very interesting. It could just be to indicate that their true identities are not important, and perhaps the intent here is to paint them as a faceless cultural force, but I'm still holding out hope on getting to see them in full at some point. Perhaps they live in the astral world, another big mystery that Oda has been holding on to this arc. Instead, the elders forced Harald to marry Estrid, a woman who has ancient giant blood. Despite this, she does not bear any horns on her head, which strikes me as unusual. In either case, hailing from the northern Brewers Village, Estrid is said to be a student of geomancy. Now, in the original Japanese, this can be understood as Chinfu, which translates to earth-wind. This is a play on the concept of Feng Shui, which can translate to wind-water. Feng Shui is a form of Chinese geomancy that refers to the idea of directing qi through a space. The joke here seems to be that Estrid is a practitioner of this Feng Shui variant that involves surrounding herself with very luxurious items and treasures. She mentions that Harald's fortune is escaping to the east, which is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Ida living in the Fisherman Village, and she also talks about this mirror being in the 5-star kill position. A lot of Chinese philosophy, including Feng Shui, revolves around Wu Jing, or the 5 classical elements. We've talked about this concept before in relation to the 5 elders and the abyss pentagrams, since the orientation of the 5 elements form the same shape. It could be that this is another tongue-in-cheek nod to that concept, as we know these abyss pentagrams would plague Elbaf in the future. Estrid orders for the mirror to be destroyed, which is another sign that she's a bit of a fraud, as breaking mirrors is believed to be a sign of misfortune in a lot of cultures. Estrid also gifts Harald with Asla, an 8-legged horse that she believes will bring Harald great fortune. We first learned of this creature as Harald's lucky steed back when Loki's crimes were being discussed earlier in the arc, where we learned that the horse was not long for this world after Loki was born. This is a nod to Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, from Norse mythology, and Estrid herself may be inspired by the Queen of Sweden during the Viking era, Estrid of the Obertrites, whose husband, King Olaf, was said to have a mistress whom he cared for, paralleling Harald's relationship with Ida. With this, we flash forward to 63 years ago on the day that Loki was born, and it seems that Harald was away on one of his voyages during this time, so Estrid alone saw Loki's arrival, as we finally get the reveal of Loki's eyes. They are very demonic in nature, perhaps almost snake-like, and this seems to be a unique trait even among giants so far, though the dark sclera of the eyes does remind me a lot of the Minx Sulong forms. Of course, it is to be seen if this is suggestive of some sort of unique ability or recessive trait found among the ancient giants, or if this is just a freak mutation. Who knows, perhaps this is even a byproduct of Estrid's heritage, with her status as a pureblood coming into question with her lack of horns. In any case, it seems the idea here is that Loki's curse was actually propagated by his own mother's hatred. Her obsession with the superficial led her to disown her own child, to the point of even sentencing him to death upon his arrival. Despite her own actions being entrenched in negative energies and bad omens, she pins everything on the newborn Loki, creating this self-fulfilling prophecy that he is the accursed prince. Speaking of prophecies, she mentions that there was a premonition that Harald would be killed by his own son, which the guard considers madness. This prophecy was also mentioned earlier in the arc and attributed to King Harald, but I have to wonder how much of that was actually true. Could it be that Estrad just put all these cursed ideas into the heads of the public? After all, the people of the Western Village were celebrating Loki's birth alongside Roto and Goldberg back during Big Mom's flashback, so these negative associations had to have come afterwards, even though the present-day villagers would have us believe that Loki was always accursed. The parallels between Loki and Hajrudin's relationship with their mothers is pretty heavy-handed here, with Loki being born to a superficial mother who denies her own child, while Hajrudin was born to a loving mother who is being denied by the people of Elbaf herself. It's also notable that our first look at Ida in this chapter is her putting on a facade of malice behind the curtains of a tent, while Estrad's front is that of benevolence, only for our last look at her to be bedridden behind curtains, as she was said to have passed just a year after Loki's birth. The imagery of Loki reaching out with no one to grab is juxtaposed with Harald being present to give Hajrudin his hand just 18 years prior, and it really makes you wonder if Loki would have turned out the same had Harald been present during that day. Instead, he was thrown down to the underworld by his own mother and left to die, only for him to scale the trunk of the Atom Tree with his bare hands just moments after being born. I spoke earlier about how Odin and Harald were both bigger-than-life characters with these Paul Bunyan-esque tales of their childhood, and Loki is just another entry to that list, perhaps even surpassing any reasonable expectation of what a less-than-a-day-old child is capable of. If you thought Big Mom killing Yorl at 5 years old was insane, this newborn decapitated a bear and perhaps even took a bite out of its stomach, as you can see bones hanging out of where that should be. This alone speaks volumes for how insane of a threat Loki must be in the present day if he was able to endure all of this as a newborn, and I'm looking forward to seeing him in action, whenever that ends up being. The chapter ends flashing forward to a few years, with Loki equipped with his club, looking like how he did in those scenes of him beating up Hajrudin. This would mean that we are skipping ahead past the time that Big Mom and Mother Carmel were occupying the village, which is a bit disappointing. I would have loved to see any potential interactions there. And this also means that Harald was not necessarily around during that time either, making me wonder if he ever even met Big Mom. We do know there was an expedition at some point where Goldberg's father fought Big Mom and had his shield turned into a homie, so perhaps that's a future conflict that we'll see in this flashback. We also know that Rox came to Elbaf at a certain point, so that's another opportunity to revisit that plotline, and of course, Loki was seeking Lola's hand in marriage, which should be further explored in this flashback as well. Lots of great things to come, and I'm looking forward to it all. Let me know down in the comments what you enjoyed about this chapter, and if there's anything in particular that you're interested in seeing. As always, you can find all of my weekly manga breakdowns in the playlist in the description, and if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.